Have you ever felt trapped inside your own mind? Like no matter what you do, your thoughts keep spiraling, telling you you're not enough, not ready, or not capable. You're not broken, but your brain has been trained by fear, stress, and repetition to think in loops, and it's time to break them. Negative thinking isn't a character flaw, it's a circuit, a pattern. And like any pattern in the brain, it grows stronger the more you use it. Your thoughts, especially the ones you repeat the most, shape your reality. But what if those thoughts are false? What if they're just outdated code running on autopilot? The good news is this: you can change the code, because your brain is plastic, changeable, adaptable, and responsive to intentional effort. Here's the truth: your brain doesn't care if a thought is good or bad. It cares if it's familiar. Every time you dwell on fear, self-doubt, or past failures, you strengthen the neural highways that carry those thoughts. But if you interrupt that cycle, even for just a few minutes each day, you can reroute the traffic, the habit. It's called cognitive reset training. And it starts with 90 seconds of focused awareness. When a negative thought shows up, pause. To label it, that's a negative loop. Take 3 deep diaphragmatic breaths. Then deliberately shift attention to what is in your control right now. This simple shift disrupts the brain's fear loop and activates the prefrontal cortex, your center for clarity and action. Imagine this. You wake up, you're already tired. Your first thought is, I can't do this today. But instead of letting that voice drive your day, you pause, you catch it mid-sentence, you breathe. You remind yourself that's not truth, that's a pattern. You ask, what's one thing I can control right now? And suddenly you're back in command, not of everything but of yourself. And that's where real strength begins. Negative thoughts often feel like truth. They come in fast, heavy, and absolute. You're not good enough. You'll fail. It's too late. These thoughts don't knock gently. They invade. And unless you've trained your mind, you don't question them. You let them settle. But here's the thing. The first step to changing your internal world is to simply catch the thought. That's it. Catch it. This is not about forcing positivity or pretending everything is okay. This is about awareness, quiet, precise, non-judgmental awareness. When we say catch the thought, we're talking about engaging the part of the brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This region allows you to observe your thinking, rather than drown in it. In neuroscience, we call this metacognition, thinking about your thoughts. It sounds simple, but this single action separates those who spiral from those who steer. Because once you can see the thought, you create space, and in that space, change begins. Most of our negative thinking is habitual. It's not even original. It's recycled fear, often inherited from past experiences, early environments, or repeated exposure to self-defeating messages. These thoughts run on loops, neural loops, and they're incredibly efficient. Why? Because the brain prefers predictability. Even if the thought is painful, if it's familiar, your brain will default to it. That's how powerful neural pathways are. So how do you disrupt this? By catching the thought in real time, before it blends into your identity. You might feel a heaviness when you wake up, a tightness in the chest, or a low, sinking voice that whispers, you won't make it. Right there, that's your moment. The moment you stop, you don't run from it, you don't fight it, you identify it. That's a negative thought loop. Not, I am anxious. Not, I am a failure. You name it for what it is, a pattern of brain activity, not a fact. This shift is subtle but foundational. You're no longer the thought, you're the observer. That distinction gives you access to the frontal part of your brain, the part responsible for logic, planning, and control. And guess what? That's where change lives. There's solid research behind this. When subjects are trained in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, or even just reflective labeling, brain scans show reduced activity in the amygdala, the fear center, and increased connectivity to the prefrontal cortex. That means the act of catching the thought literally quiets the emotional storm and strengthens the thinking brain. You're not imagining the effect. You're changing your neurochemistry. But here's where it gets hard and real. This isn't always clean. The first few times you try, the thoughts may come with such force that you forget to catch them. That's okay. This isn't about perfection. It's about practice. The more you do it, the earlier you catch it. And eventually, what took you hours to recover from takes you 5 minutes, then 2, then seconds. That's how neuroplasticity works, through repetition, intensity, and attention. Let's get practical. When a negative thought arises, pause. Internally say, that's a thought. Or if it helps, label it more directly, that's fear. That's insecurity, that's doubt. Naming it activates the prefrontal cortex. That's not philosophy. That's neuroscience. You're teaching your brain that this thought doesn't deserve autopilot. It deserves a checkpoint. And if you can, write it down. Externalizing the thought creates another level of psychological distance. It goes from being inside you to outside you. And often when we see these thoughts on paper, they lose their weight. They shrink. You realize how absurd, how irrational, or how familiar they really are. That's power. You've moved from being inside the storm to observing it from a safe distance. Some people ask, isn't this just over? No, this is training. and training takes effort. You don't get stronger by avoiding resistance. You get stronger by meeting it again and again with presence. And every time you catch a thought that used to run your day, your week, your life, you reclaim territory in your own mind. That's not a metaphor. That's a measurable physical change in the brain. The myelin sheath thickens around new thought pathways. Dopamine gets rerouted toward intentional thinking. The brain reorganizes around new defaults. This is not about controlling every thought. That's impossible. Thoughts will always come, but you get to decide which ones stay. And that decision starts with awareness. With catching, with creating just enough space to say, this is not me, this is a pattern, and I can choose differently. Asterisk, once you've caught the negative thought, the next step is to interrupt the loop. That might sound too simple, like flipping a switch, but what you're really doing is something much more profound. You're shifting your physiology and disrupting a deeply rooted neural pattern. When you're stuck in a negative thinking cycle, your nervous system is not in a calm, neutral state. It's aroused, activated, sometimes even in full-on sympathetic overdrive, the classic fight or flight response. What people often don't realize is that negative thinking doesn't just live in the mind, it's stored in the body. The tight jaw, the shallow breath, the clenched hands, the rapid heartbeat, these aren't separate from your thoughts. They are the other side of the same loop. So to interrupt the loop, you don't start with logic, you start with the body. That's why this step begins with something deceptively simple. 3 slow, diaphragmatic breaths. In through the nose, deep into the belly, out through the mouth, twice as slow as the inhale. This act, when done with full attention, engages the parasympathetic nervous system. It tells the body, we are safe. And when the body hears that, the mind starts to follow. Now, why 3 breaths? Why not 10? Why not just 1? There's a reason, a physiological reason. The vagus nerve, which connects your brain to most of your body's organs, is deeply responsive to rhythm, especially the rhythm of exhalation. When you extend the exhale, you stimulate vagal tone, lowering heart rate and decreasing the activity of stress hormones like cortisol and norepinephrine. That's not anecdotal, it's backed by decades of research. One study from Stanford showed that intentional breathing can shift brain states even more reliably than meditation for certain individuals. So these 3 breaths aren't about relaxing. They are about regaining control of your internal state so you can make decisions from clarity rather than chaos. But this is where most people stop. They breathe, they feel slightly better, and then the thought returns. Why? Because the loop wasn't just emotional, it was electrical. It had velocity, momentum. You interrupted it for a moment, but you didn't derail it yet. And here's the truth. 1 breath cycle isn't enough to erase years of reactive wiring. What we're aiming for is consistency, not intensity. So when you take those 3 breaths, you don't just breathe, you become the breath. You focus all your awareness on the inhale, noticing the air moving in, the slight expansion of your ribs, the rise of the chest. Then you soften the exhale, slow it down, stretch it out. If a thought shows up, you label it again, loop, and return to the breath. And something interesting happens when you do this. The storm quiets, just a bit. The noise softens. The signal, your actual conscious awareness, starts to come through. You're no longer fused to the thought. You're standing next to it, breathing, watching it dissolve. This is what real mental training looks like. Not dramatic, not flashy, but powerful, because now you're not reacting, you're resetting. There's a term in neuroscience called top-down regulation. It refers to the ability of the higher brain, the prefrontal cortex, to regulate the lower brain, the limbic system. Breathing is one of the fastest gateways to access this. When you breathe with intention, you're not just calming the body. You're giving your brain the signal that you are in control. That's the opposite of what negative thinking does. Negative thinking says, you're stuck, you're helpless, you're trapped. But the breath says, you're here, you're aware, you're alive. And let's be honest, sometimes, in the middle of a storm of inner criticism or anxiety or fear, the idea of shifting your breath feels almost absurd. You want to fix everything at once. But your nervous system doesn't need everything fixed. It needs to know it's safe. When you breathe like this, you are showing your nervous system that it doesn't have to keep firing the emergency signal. And that, right there, is the reset. People want change to feel dramatic. They want transformation to come with thunder and lightning. But real change, lasting neurological change, often starts with something quiet, something slow, something like 3 deep breaths taken with complete presence. This is how you break the loop, not with force but with precision. Not by suppressing the thought, but by disarming the system that's keeping it alive. Over time, this becomes a skill. You'll find yourself walking into a stressful situation, a confrontation, a moment of doubt, an emotional trigger, and instead of spiraling, you pause, you breathe, and the breath becomes the buffer. It gives you time, space, choice. That's the power of physiological self. It doesn't eliminate the thought, but it gives you the distance to decide whether it deserves your energy. Most of the time it doesn't. You don't need a guru. You don't need a mantra. You need 3 breaths. That's the starting point. That's the signal to your mind that the game has changed. that you are no longer willing to live at the mercy of loops you didn't choose, that from this moment forward, every time the cycle begins, you have a way out, and it begins not in the mind, but in the body. Asterisk, once you've caught the thought and interrupted the physiological loop with your breath, you arrive at a critical crossroads, the place where attention meets intention. This is where you refocus your lens, because now, with your nervous system settled, and your awareness no longer hijacked by a reactive loop, your mind becomes available. It becomes ready for redirection. And what you choose to focus on next in this narrow window of calm is what determines whether the loop returns or whether you build a new path entirely. This moment is subtle. It doesn't come with fanfare. It's not going to feel magical or even dramatic. It's going to feel quiet, maybe even fragile. But neurologically, it's one of the most important pivots you can make in your mental life. It's the moment where you turn from ruminating on what you cannot control to consciously choosing what you can. Your brain has an attentional filter. It's called the reticular activating system. This filter doesn't process everything around you that would overwhelm you. Instead, it selects what matters most. And the question your brain is constantly asking is, where should I focus my limited energy and resources? The answer you give through habit, through repetition, through emotional priority is what shapes that filter. And when you live in negative thought cycles, that filter becomes attuned to threat, to limitation, to self-criticism. You don't see things as they are. You see them through the lens of fear. And the lens of fear is narrow, hyper-focused on danger, and deeply resistant to change. So this step, refocusing your lens, is about deliberately choosing what gets through that filter. It's not about pretending the negative thought didn't happen. It's not about fake positivity. It's about shifting from the emotional noise of what's outside your control to the actionable clarity of what's within your grasp. That's where power lives. Not in what happened yesterday. Not in what someone else thinks. Not in how perfect you feel. But in what you can do right now. There's a simple but profound question I recommend using in this exact moment. What is true right now, and what can I control? These two frames of reference anchor you back to the present. The first part, what is true right now, that brings you into reality. Not imagined futures, not catastrophic predictions, but the current, grounded state of your existence. Maybe the truth is that you're tired, or that you're anxious, or that you failed before. But maybe the truth is also that you're still standing. You still have breath, you still have time, and most importantly, you still have choice. The brain, when given truthful information, calms. It stops preparing for imaginary outcomes and begins organizing around facts. This re-engages the prefrontal cortex and allows executive functions, problem-solving, planning, creativity, to return online. The second part, what can I control, creates traction. Because one of the primary drivers of helplessness and rumination is the illusion of control over things that are completely outside your jurisdiction. The past, other people's opinions, outcomes, time. When your energy is being spent on what you cannot touch, your system burns out. And when that happens, you lose agency. But even in the most overwhelming circumstances, there's always something you can control. Maybe it's your breath. Maybe it's how you speak to yourself. Maybe it's the next step, not the full journey, but the next 5 feet. The act of naming that, of focusing on what's inside the zone of control, brings the nervous system back into alignment. Because control equals safety, and safety equals focus. There's a concept in neurobiology called attentional anchoring. When you shift your focus to something specific and immediate, even something as simple as feeling your feet on the ground or counting the lines on your palm, you are giving your brain place to rest its attention. This is how you override chaotic thought loops. Not by fighting them directly, but by redirecting the beam of awareness to a place that's stable and known. Your brain's focus system is like a flashlight. It can only shine in one direction at a time. If you point it toward what you can influence, the shadows behind you become less relevant. Not gone, but less dominant. Let's take a practical example. Say the thought is, I'm not good enough for this role. You've caught it, you've taken your breath. Now, instead of arguing with it or spiraling further, you pause and ask, what is true right now? Maybe the truth is, I feel unsure. Okay, that's valid. What else is true? I prepared for this. I've worked hard. I've faced challenges before. That's also true. Then you ask, what can I control? Maybe the answer is, I can focus on doing my best in this moment. I can ask one clear question. I can hold my body in a strong posture. I can take another breath. That's it. Nothing complex, but everything powerful. The repetition of this process is what creates change. The first few times, your brain will want to go back to the old route. It'll try to drag you toward the known, the practiced loop, the self-doubt that's expected. But with repetition, the new path becomes easier to access. You start building a new default, one that doesn't ignore reality, but engages with it in a way that gives you back your strength, one that moves from reactivity to response, and one that doesn't wait for the world to change in order to feel peace, but instead builds peace from the inside out. This is not wishful thinking. It's cortical rewiring. When you consistently practice refocusing your lens, when you habitually direct attention toward the controllable, the immediate, the real, your brain prunes the old fear-based circuits and strengthens the new ones. Synaptic connections related to self-efficacy and optimism get reinforced. Dopamine is released not just in response to outcomes, but in response to effort. And that's where resilience comes from. Not from ignoring what's hard, but from knowing exactly where to look when it gets hard. There's something very empowering about this process, even though it begins in such a small space, because it reminds you that no matter how loud the noise becomes, no matter how strong the old loop feels, you are not without tools. You are not helpless. You are not defined by thought, emotion, or memory. You are defined by what you do next, and what you choose to focus on becomes the foundation for everything that follows. When you ask yourself, what is true, and what can I control? You are doing far more than calming your mind. You are stepping back into the driver's seat of your own life. And that neurologically, emotionally, and psychologically is where transformation begins. There's a moment, right after you've grounded yourself in truth and reclaimed control over your focus, where the brain becomes incredibly receptive. It's calm, it's present, and most importantly, it's listening. This is the space where you begin to introduce new patterns, and not just intellectually, but neurologically. Because when the old loop gets interrupted and the lens gets shifted, your mind creates an opportunity, one of the rare windows when your internal dialogue can be rewired. That's where this next step lives. It's the introduction of a new signal, a replacement thought, a deliberate, clear statement, rooted in evidence and experience. It's not about motivation. It's about retraining your brain to recognize and prioritize the kinds of thoughts that create movement, confidence, and internal coherence. This is the practice of speaking truth out loud consciously, repetitively, and in your own voice. When you say something out loud, you're not just reinforcing it cognitively. You're engaging multiple brain systems at once: language, auditory feedback, motor control, and memory. This multi-sensory integration deepens the impact of the message. Neuroscience calls this embodied cognition, where thought is not limited to the mind but is processed through the body. When you speak a statement, especially one with emotional weight, you activate circuits that extend far beyond just comprehension. You feel it, you process it through your breath, your posture, your tone. That's what makes it powerful. And when that statement is one of empowerment, especially after disrupting a negative loop, it acts as a counterweight. It gives your nervous system a new narrative to orient itself around. But here's the catch: it has to be real. Your brain has a radar for falsehood. If you try to affirm something that you fundamentally don't believe, the mind will reject it. You can't say I'm a success if your body is trembling with fear and your recent memory is filled with failures. That will backfire. The goal here isn't to lie to yourself, it's to root yourself in evidence-based affirmations. So, instead of saying, I'm amazing, say, I've overcome hard things before. That's true. Instead of nothing can stop me, say, I've kept going even when I didn't feel ready. That's also true. These aren't fantasies, they're facts. They're grounded in your lived experience, and that makes them neurologically potent. There's something important to understand about memory here. The brain does not perfectly recall events. It reconstructs them. Every time you remember something, your brain re-encodes it. Which means if you deliberately recall moments of strength, of resilience, of clarity, and attach language to them, you're reinforcing those networks. You're making those experiences more accessible. So when you say, I've done difficult things, you're not just describing the past, you're conditioning your mind to see difficulty as familiar terrain, not a barrier. This is how self-belief is built, not through hype, but through repetition of truths that are difficult to deny. There's also a link between self-talk and emotional regulation. Studies from sports psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy, and even trauma recovery consistently show that when individuals speak supportive, reality-based affirmations, their stress markers decline. Cortisol drops, heart rate stabilizes, they recover faster. Why? Because language is a regulatory tool. Your words are not just reflections of thought, they are tools that can steer your internal state. And after a negative thought loop, your internal state is vulnerable. You've interrupted the old circuitry, yes, but you need to replace it with something. And if you don't, the mind defaults back to the familiar: fear, doubt, chaos. That's why this step matters. You're not just speaking words, you're laying new tracks in your brain. Let's make this even more real. Imagine you've just gone through the first 3 steps. The negative thought came, you caught it, you breathed through it, you focused on what's true and within your control. Now you speak. Out loud, alone, if you need to. You say, I've done harder things than this. You say, I am learning how to lead my mind. You say, this is uncomfortable, but I'm not in danger. You say, the fact that I'm here right now proves I haven't given up. Each of those statements is an anchor. Each one sends a signal deep into your limbic system saying, we're okay, we're aligned, we're capable. These are not just motivational phrases, they are neurological activators. You're not waiting for the mind to change, you're changing it with your voice. And here's what happens over time. These statements become more automatic. The voice of self-trust grows louder. The gap between a negative loop and your recovery shortens. The brain begins to associate stress with redirection, not collapse. That's a massive shift in identity. You're no longer someone who reacts. You're someone who resets and reroutes, and every time you do it, every time you speak, that truth, you're adding weight to the new identity. You're telling the brain, this is who we are now. It's also worth noting that tone matters, not just what you say, but how you say it. When you speak with hesitation or collapse into the words, the brain detects incongruence, but when you speak with a calm, grounded tone, low in pitch, steady in rhythm, you activate different physiological systems. You engage the vagus nerve more deeply. You stabilize the diaphragm. You build coherence between your breath, your voice, and your nervous system. This isn't just psychology, it's biology. That's why when someone speaks with conviction, even if they're saying something simple, it feels powerful. Your tone teaches your body how to respond. You don't need a long list of affirmations, you need a few that are true, a few that are yours. Write them, refine them, speak them in the morning, speak them when things go sideways. Speak them when no one's watching. You are not speaking to impress others, you are speaking to instruct your own nervous system. Because in those moments of darkness, your body is listening, your brain is listening, and your words, if chosen carefully and spoken with intention, can become the most powerful tool you own. This is how new loops form. This is how thought becomes belief, not through one massive insight, but through a pattern of catching the old and replacing it with something stronger, something truer. And the moment you speak those truths out loud, they echo in the nervous system. They begin carving new grooves. They replace the reflex of collapse with the reflex of grounding. You are literally teaching your brain a new way to respond to stress. You're building reflexive resilience, neurogrit that forms not from ignoring pain, but from retraining your focus, your physiology, and your voice in the middle of it. That's the work. That's the path. That's the real science of change. Asterisk, there's a misconception about change that's been fed to us by culture, media, and even some motivational narratives that transformation has to be big, dramatic, fast. But that's not how the nervous system works. The brain doesn't rewire through occasional effort. It rewires through repetition, through the steady daily re-engagement of small behaviors that signal to your system, this is the new path. This is how we respond now. That's why the final and most crucial step is to make it daily, not weekly. Not when it's convenient, not when you feel inspired daily, because when you engage a pattern consistently, especially when you don't feel like it, you tell your brain something vital. This is important, this is safe, and this is who I am now. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change, is not triggered by intensity alone. It's triggered by intensity plus frequency plus focus. That means what you do repeatedly becomes who you are neurologically. If you practice reacting to fear, your brain gets better at fear. If you practice catching thoughts, breathing through them, shifting your focus, and reinforcing truth, your brain gets better at resilience. It's that simple. It's also that hard. Because the system isn't going to reward you immediately. There will be no applause, no dramatic feedback loop, not at first. That's where most people stop. They try something once, maybe twice, and when the emotional spike wears off, they interpret the silence as failure. But it's not failure, it's neural latency. The system is waiting to see if you're serious. The neurons involved in negative thought patterns, those are strong. They fire together 1,000 times. They've been rehearsed, reinforced, emotionally charged. You don't erase them overnight. But what you can do is start to build a competing pathway. A new circuit that fires with a different kind of energy. Awareness, regulation, direction, and clarity. And the only way that new circuit becomes the dominant one is through daily activation. So what does this look like? It means taking these tools every single day and applying them even when you don't need them, especially when you don't need them. Because waiting until you're already deep in a mental spiral to start practicing is like trying to build a parachute after you've jumped out of the plane. Instead, you train ahead of time. You build the reflex in the calm so it's available in the storm. You wake up, and before the mind begins its familiar chatter, you breathe. You anchor into the moment. You speak the truth out loud. You prepare the mind the same way an athlete prepares the body, with discipline, repetition, and precision. There's research from cognitive neuroscience that shows when a behavior is repeated at the same time each day, especially within a narrow time window, the brain starts to predict that behavior and automates it. This is called time-based conditioning, and it makes your new habits more sticky. That's why doing this in the morning matters. It's not just about setting the tone, it's about syncing your cognitive systems around a central behavior. Your internal clock, circadian, hormonal, neural begin to align with the signal you're sending. That signal is, we begin the day by reclaiming control. That becomes your baseline. That becomes your set point. And from there, you're operating with a mind that's not in defense mode, but in creation mode. Now, you will have days when this feels hollow. Days when you go through the motions and it seems like nothing is happening. That's normal. That's part of the adaptation process. The brain doesn't measure value by how good something feels, it measures it by consistency and salience. So even if you feel flat, Even if the thought comes and it feels stronger than your voice, you do the reps, because the rep is the rewiring. And just like with physical training, progress isn't always visible in the moment, but over time you'll feel it. The thought will come, and instead of swallowing you whole, it'll just brush past. You'll catch it quicker, breathe steadier, refocus faster. That's not luck, that's neuroplastic adaptation. And this practice doesn't have to be long. People think they need an hour of meditation or an elaborate routine. But the truth is, 5 to 10 minutes of focused, structured mental training can outperform hours of scattered, distracted effort. The brain loves focus. Short, intense focus, repeated daily builds long-term change. That's why even a micro-practice done, at the same time, with full attention can change the shape and strength of neural circuits. The key is not missing. Even one day missed weakens the chain. That's not meant to induce guilt. It's meant to highlight reality. Consistency builds certainty. Certainty builds identity. Identity builds behavior that lasts. There's a psychological principle called self-signaling. It means every action you take is a vote for the kind of person you believe yourself to be. So when you do this work daily, you're not just interrupting thought patterns, you're redefining yourself. You're saying, I'm the kind of person who meets difficulty with clarity. I'm the kind of person who trains my mind. And the more you vote for that identity, the more natural it becomes. What used to take conscious effort becomes default. That's what happens when plasticity becomes embodiment. You move from trying to believing, from believing to knowing. This daily practice also begins to impact how you experience your entire environment. You'll notice fewer triggers. You'll feel less pulled by external chaos, not because the world has changed, but because you have changed. Your nervous system becomes more efficient at filtering out noise. Your brain stops chasing every narrative and starts choosing its responses, and other people will notice. They may not know what's changed, but they'll feel the steadiness in you. That's the result of showing up daily for your mind, even when the world isn't watching, and on the days when it's hardest, when you're tired, when the thoughts feel relentless, when your system wants to collapse. That's when the daily practice matters most, because those are the reps that go deepest. Those are the signals that tell your brain, even now, even here, I lead. That's how mental toughness is built, not by avoiding struggle but by meeting it with structure. And that structure, if built daily, becomes a sanctuary, a place you can return to no matter what the world throws at you. This is not about being perfect, it's about being present. Not about mastering your mind in one grand leap, but about training it one breath, one redirect, one truth at a time. And when that becomes part of your daily rhythm, when it becomes as regular as brushing your teeth, as automatic as putting on shoes, you've crossed a threshold. You're not trying to reset anymore. You are reset. You don't chase the state. You embody the state. And from that place, everything you do carries a different energy, not reaction, but intention, not panic, but poise, not fear, but clarity. Because the work was done daily, quietly, repeatedly, until it became who you are. Asterisk, negative thoughts aren't facts, they're habits, and just like any habit, they can be broken with clarity, intention, and repetition. You don't need to control every thought. You just need to catch the wrong ones before they take root. Start today. Because your mind was built to adapt, and the future version of you, the one who's calm, focused, and unstoppable, that version is just one I thought away.